Hello and welcome to the next lecture. Today's topic will be World War I. It began in Europe in 1914, but the United States didn't become involved until 1917. We'll explore its impact today. There are a few themes to be addressed in this presentation. First of all, we'll see why and how the United States became involved. Why was it that it began in 1914, but the U.S. took a few years to become involved? But the biggest area that we'll explore would be the impact of the war on the United States government, the economy, and American society. In the back of your mind, you want to keep this question just kind of in the forefront. You want to be able to evaluate the impact of World War I on the United States. Do you think as a result, the United States changed for the better or the worse? We will begin with an explanation of World War I, the battlefront. There were many long-term causes that resulted in the First World War. First of all, there was the rapid rise of Germany and Italy. Once those two countries became unified in their modern form, it really upset the balance of power in Europe. That was probably the biggest factor. Also, there was competition over imperialism, there was an arms race, there was an alliance system, and tremendous nationalism in different countries. The spark that started the First World War was an assassination. The image on the right shows Franz Ferdinand and his wife. He was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. In the summer of 1914, he and his wife were assassinated by Serbian terrorists. They were members of an organization called the Black Hand that wanted their independence from Austria-Hungary. Here we see some headlines from, of all things, the Ludington Daily News from 1914. You can see the arrows pointing to the headline, Archduke Franz Ferdinand shot down by youth. Fighting began not too long after the assassination, and it pitted two groups of alliances against one another. The Allied powers were led by Great Britain, France, and Russia. The Central Powers were led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey's leadership was in the form of the Ottoman Empire. Next, I'd like to look at American involvement in the war. The President of the United States at the time is shown here. It was Woodrow Wilson. He declared that the United States would remain neutral, and the Americans should remain neutral in thought as well as in action. However, the United States did have strong economic ties to the British, as well as a common language and history. There were two major events that led to American involvement in the war. The first was unrestricted submarine warfare undertaken by Germany. The image on the right provides a visual aid identifying this unrestricted submarine warfare. Essentially, what Germany did was they said that any vessel that entered into that pink area around the British Isles could be attacked by a German submarine. They thought that if a country was trading with the British, that they would be aiding them in the war. Well, the United States was very much opposed to this and said that this violated America's right as a neutral nation. Both the Americans and the British were upset by this policy. The concern was that civilians would be impacted by it. On the left, we see an image of the Lusitania. This was a British passenger ship, essentially like a cruise ship. Many Americans were warned not to go to that ship and not to board it because it was going into that unrestricted submarine warfare zone around the British Isles. This is actually an example of a warning that the German government paid for, basically warning American civilians not to go on the Lusitania because the British and the Germans were at war with one another, and this ship was going to be going into that war zone. Well, on its way from New York to the British Isles, that ship was actually torpedoed in 1915. It sank very quickly, and about 1,200 people died. Of the 1,200, 128 of those victims were Americans. This was a public relations nightmare for the Germans, and they pledged publicly to stop this policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Americans were upset at the sinking of the Lusitania, but they became furious when they heard about the Zimmermann telegram. The Zimmermann telegram was a message that was sent from the German foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, to the Mexican government. This was intercepted by the British and shared with the Americans. It involved three main points. First of all, the German government asked Mexico to attack the United States. Secondly, once the United States was distracted, Germany would eventually help Mexico defeat the Americans. Third, why should Mexico do this? Well, Mexico would then be able to recapture land that the United States had previously taken from Mexico. This map identifies American territorial expansion in the 1800s. The circled area that's kind of orange on the map shows the American Southwest. That was originally part of Mexico, but as a result of the Mexican War between the United States and Mexico, the United States won the war and obtained that particular territory. Well, what Germany was suggesting was that if Mexico attacked the United States, Mexico could get that territory back. As you might suspect, once this Zimmermann telegram became public, the American people clamored for war against Germany. Why would Germany do this? Well, in 1917, Germany took a gamble. They resumed their submarine warfare. They sent this message to the Mexican government because after years of war, they were being bled dry. And so they thought, well, if we have this one final push, we'll be able to win in this war. But it failed. And eventually, the United States declared war in the aftermath of the resumption of the submarine warfare, as well as the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram. Here we are back at that slide showing the alliance system in World War I. The United States eventually joined the Allied powers, along with the British, French, and Russians. I'd like to briefly outline some of the American contributions to the war effort. First of all, about 2 million American soldiers fought in Europe during the war, and they were under the direction of General John Pershing. The American troops did see combat fighting along with the French as they helped to stem many of Germany's attacks. The biggest things that the Americans provided, well, they provided supplies and an emotional lift for groups of soldiers that had been fighting for 3 years. Eventually, a ceasefire went into effect on November 11th, 1918. Next, we'll explore the impact of World War I on the American home front. The size and power of the American government grew during World War I. One example of this would be the Selective Service Act, also known as the draft. Essentially, all males between 18 and 45 became eligible for the draft. You weren't going to be able to pay your way out of service during World War I. Instead, a lottery system was developed for men between those ages. One interesting fact is that 20% or 1 in 5 of those draftees were actually born outside the United States. Building on this theme of the United States being a nation of immigrants, we see this poster on the right. Immigrants were encouraged to learn the language of English. They also were encouraged to become American citizens and to learn about American history. The poster on the right was actually printed in 6 different languages when it was originally created by the Cleveland Board of Education. One last thing that I wanted to mention about the Selective Service Act was that in the state of Michigan, 40% of the men who were drafted actually failed their physical. This had a long-term impact on the educational curriculum in American public schools. It led to mandated PE classes for students. Here we see some recruiting posters trying to encourage men to sign up for the armed forces. On the left, you could destroy this mad brute and enlist, and you could protect this scantily clad woman from a German who is actually dehumanized here by showing that this German soldier is an ape. On the right, you've got a woman saying, well, gee, wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy. Real men serve in the armed forces is kind of the message that we see here. On the left, we see another American propaganda poster Does it look familiar to you? He's watching you. You better watch out what you're doing and what you're saying. I wonder where George Lucas got his idea for the villain, Darth Vader. Steps developed to pay for World War I also helped to show this growth in the size and power of the national government. The cost of the war was quite expensive, over $35 billion. The person put in charge of raising money for the war was shown here, William McAdoo. People actually called him the Crown Prince of the American government because he was the son-in-law of Woodrow Wilson. He also served as the Secretary of the Treasury. He led that effort to raise money. The U.S. government took 2 steps to raise the money. First of all, income tax rates were raised pretty high. And Americans also got the money the old-fashioned way. They borrowed it by purchasing war bonds. People could purchase Liberty bonds, and that could help to contribute to the war effort. Maybe those Liberty bonds were 10 years, and so people could buy them, and then they would get their money back after 10 years, along with significant interest. On the left, we see a poster. Hey, everybody should remember Belgium. That's where some of the fighting took place during the war. And here we see a German soldier attacking a scantily clad woman once again. And on the right, we see the actor Douglas Fairbanks, who was at a war bond rally encouraging people to support the war by purchasing war bonds. The last example of the growth of the government that I'd like to mention would be the Committee for Public Information. This was established by Congress in 1917 and headed by George Creel. Sometimes it's called the Creel Committee. This was a government-sponsored agency, basically a propaganda agency, designed to try to develop as much support for American involvement in the war as possible. You see one of their posters on the left. Some additional advertisements to promote American involvement in the war, and different people could contribute in a range of ways, are shown here. I already did show the one on the left, but in the middle you see that, hey, everyone can be patriotic, and a way to show your patriotism would be to try to save food so that soldiers in the field would be able to have enough themselves. So if civilians cut back on their consumption of different goods, well, those goods could then be used for soldiers. We also see that even stenographers could help with the war effort because the government needed people to work in those different agencies. Next, we'll explore how American involvement in World War I impacted the economy and society. In 2 words, the United States economy experienced an economic boom. You see some statistics on the left identifying the impact to manufacturing as well as real wages for workers. On the right, you see a poster from the Fuel Administration. It focused and is identifying the fact that we need more coal, and the coal industry is one example of one of those areas that really experienced an economic boom. Interestingly enough, this poster was printed in multiple languages, again reinforcing the fact that the United States at the time was really a nation of immigrants. Michigan's economy prospered just like that of many other states. Agriculture continues to be an important part of Michigan's economy today. Well, during World War I, it was also a major part of the economy, and we see a big increase in production for farmers. The automobile industry was in its infancy during this time period. However, production of cars increased fourfold. Another example of the boost for Michigan's economy was a brand new place to try to train recruits. It was called Camp Custer, located in Battle Creek. The construction and the number of soldiers who were going through the new camp led to $10 million of revenue for the state. Here are some statistics that demonstrate how American farmers prospered. The price of corn more than doubled between 1913 and 1918. We see a similar trend here dealing with the price of cotton. As the United States was producing lots of uniforms for those soldiers to wear, well, the demand for cotton went up, and you see the price did as well. Race relations and gender roles were impacted by American involvement in the war. We'll explore those next. American involvement in World War I sparked the first great migration of African Americans from the deep South into northern communities like Chicago and Detroit and New York as they searched for jobs. Many African Americans hoped to leave racism and Jim Crow and segregation behind, but often that was not the case. In some cases, this led to racial violence. This was best seen in the city of East St. Louis, Illinois. There, white mobs objected to the influx of black families coming into their city by torching the homes of black residents. As many African Americans fled their homes, some were shot. In the end, over 300 buildings were destroyed, and at least 39 African Americans lay dead. Women's roles were also impacted by American involvement in the war. Over 11,000 women served in the armed forces, this was in the Navy, overseas during the war. And an additional 1 million women worked in industry during the war. There were relatively few women working in the railroad industry prior to World War I. But as you can see in this image, here we see a full crew of women working for the Union Pacific Railroad. Women jumped at the chance to work in industries like this because they could earn higher wages. They also demonstrated that they were just as successful at their jobs as their male counterparts. Lastly, we'll explore examples of patriotism during the war, some of which actually turned ugly. Patriotism was quite strong, and many people volunteered in a variety of ways to contribute to the war effort. The Food Administration encouraged people to cut back on certain types of food, so many slogans were common like having meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, and serve beans by all means. If people grew their own vegetables in their victory gardens, then every man, woman, and child could contribute to the war effort in a variety of different ways. Here we see another one of those World War I posters, as this woman draped in the American flag was planting her own vegetables because every garden is like a munitions plant, contributing to the war effort. Some of that patriotism turned ugly as an anti-German hysteria swept throughout the country. Americans began to fear all things German, like food. Americans stopped eating bratwurst and frankfurters during the war. Instead, they ate hot dogs. Liberty cabbage replaced sauerkraut on menus. On the upper right, we see, I don't like dogs, like a dachshund, because that's a German type of dog. On the bottom right, we see a sign outside of a park warning children to beware of Germans. Only loyal Americans are welcome at this park. Michigan also succumbed to this. Some cities changed their name from German-sounding names to French names, like the city of Berlin to Marne. Now, I know these aren't the greatest photos, but have you ever driven down to Grand Rapids and on 96, when you come to the city of Marne, Marne actually has the Berlin Raceway located there. The city of Marne used to be called Berlin, but as Americans began to fear anything German, the residents of Berlin decided to change their name to Marne, which was a city in France. So that's why the Berlin Raceway is located in the city of Marne. Next time you drive down to Grand Rapids, you may want to check it out. Prior to World War I, the German language was the most commonly taught foreign language in Michigan's public schools. Well, it was abandoned during the war. There also were examples of violence against German Americans. The best example took place in Illinois. There, a mob actually lynched a German-born man. In the subsequent trial, the leaders of that mob were actually exonerated for their actions. This patriotism clearly turned ugly in some cases. One last example of this anti-German hysteria deals with alcohol. On the left, you see some images of some posters promoting prohibition of alcohol or making alcohol illegal. Support for prohibition got its final push during the war, as critics argued that Alcohol was a German attempt to undermine American morality. The names of different brewing companies, Anheuser-Busch, Schlitz, Pabst, well, those are German-sounding names. Eventually, Congress passed the 18th Amendment during the war, and it went into effect in 1920. Well, we're just about done. I'd like to review some final thoughts and comments in the next slide. Well, there are a few things to keep in mind with this presentation. First of all, World War I started in 1914 in Europe. The Americans initially were neutral. However, as a result of German unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram, the United States became involved in 1917. American involvement in the war had a major impact on the home front in many areas. What you want to do is you want to be able to evaluate whether you think those changes were positive or negative for the country. Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something new. Take care, have a great day, and we'll see you online.